Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. Today is Comprehensivist Wednesday, and I'm delighted to have my friend CJ back talking about inductive attitude, the moral basis of science. Take it away, CJ.
Thank you, Shrikant. Welcome to Comprehensivist Wednesdays, our weekly series of events to foster the art of comprehensivism, an emerging practice that takes seriously Buckminster Fuller's observation that we want to understand all and put everything together. In this practice, we value learning from other traditions of inquiry and action. We value learning from all our communicated experiences and from the ethnosphere, our all-encompassing cultural zone. To assess this learning, we value accumulating and comparing many working hypotheses, conjectures, guesses, theories, and explanations to comprehensively inform our vast inventory of knowledge. Tonight, our topic is the inductive attitude, a moral basis for science and comprehensivism. At the December 16th event, we learned the value of considering multiple working hypotheses to sharpen our assessments in investigations, learning, in civic life, and for our comprehensivity, the quality of our learning that is ever more extensive and ever more intensive and ever more integrated. Since the extensive learning of comprehensivism pulls in so much from humanity's vast cultural heritage, we need epistemic virtues, criteria for good knowledge to aid us in making sense of and assessing all that we have accumulated. What other epistemic virtues might we adopt? Let's consider George Polya's 1954 book, Induction and Analogy in Mathematics. He states, strictly speaking, all our knowledge consists of conjectures, end quote. Conjectures are statements or assertions that claim to understand something. They are hypotheses. Polya emphasizes in this book that they are guesses. Polya invites us in. Let us learn guessing. Polya says, mathematics in the making resembles any other human knowledge in the making. You have to guess a mathematical theorem before you prove it. You have to guess the idea of the proof before you carry through the details. In Polya's book, mathematics is not a bunch of ex post facto theorems. Ex post facto means after the fact, discovered later and discovered before. It is the art of guessing patterns that have not yet been formulated. Polya claims that all human knowledge is guessed at and secured in the same way. His question is clear. How can we guess? How can we devise or invent conjectures? How can we hypothesize? These are the arts of induction. Polya writes, observe that inductive reasoning is a particular case of plausible reasoning. Okay, reasoning seems to me is about how to assess or secure our knowledge. Inductive reasoning uses experience to secure our knowledge. So Polya, when he says we support our conjectures by plausible reasoning, is suggesting that plausible reasoning is any way to support our knowledge, whether it uses experience like inductive reasoning or some other method. However, as far as I can tell, inductive and plausible reasoning are synonymous because all reasoning has to be based on experience. What else could it be based on? God's word? I mean, intuition? We all have different intuitions. You know, at some point, it's all experience, as far as I can see. Polya's objective in his book, Induction and Analogy in Mathematics, is to curate and explore examples in mathematics that can teach us skill in the practice and understanding of induction. Indeed, Polya goes even further. He suggests that mathematics provides a laboratory for, as he puts it, investigating induction inductively. But this book, which is a sequel to Polya's delightful and very accessible 1945 book, How to Solve It, that Shrikant mentioned last month. This book, Induction and Analogy in Mathematics, is significantly more demanding of a reader's mathematical skills. I have organized 28 meetup events over the past 6 years to explore just the first 7 chapters, a mere 120 pages. Despite its many advanced parts, Induction and Analogy in Mathematics makes many accessible and interesting observations about induction. We will focus on those, the accessible parts of the book, that might provide insights into the epistemic virtues we seek. In chapter 1 of the book, Polya has this powerful but succinct definition of induction. He says, induction is the endeavor to extract the most correct belief from a given experience and to gather the most appropriate experience in order to establish the correct belief regarding a given question. This is a powerful and incisive statement. Induction has 2 aspects. First, to extract or guess or infer a conjecture from experience. And second, to survey or seek out or design experience to establish or support a conjecture. In both cases, it is about assessing the correctness of our beliefs, our conjectures, our hypotheses, our guesses, our theories, our proposed explanations, our proposed descriptions. Polya, later on in chapter 1, explains the inductive attitude. I love the text, it's very good, and it's in the public domain, so I'm legally allowed to quote it at length. The inductive attitude, this is a long quote from Polya. In our personal life, we often cling to illusions. That is, we do not dare to examine certain beliefs which could easily be contradicted by experience because we are afraid of upsetting our emotional balance. There may be circumstances in which it is not unwise to cling to illusions. But in science, we need a very different attitude, the inductive attitude. This attitude aims at adapting our beliefs to our experience as efficiently as possible. It requires a certain preference for what is matter of fact. It requires a ready assent from observations to generalizations, and a ready descent from the highest generalizations to the most concrete observations. It requires saying maybe and perhaps in 1,000 different shades. It requires many other things, especially the following three. First, we should be ready to revise any one of our beliefs. Second, we should change a belief when there is a compelling reason to change it. And third, we should not change a belief wantonly without some good reason. These points sound pretty trivial, yet one needs rather unusual qualities to live up to them. The first point needs intellectual courage. You need courage to revise your beliefs. Galileo challenging the prejudice of his contemporaries and the authority of Aristotle is a great example of intellectual courage. The second point needs intellectual honesty. To stick to my conjecture that has been clearly contradicted by experience just because it is my conjecture would be dishonest. The third point needs wise restraint. To change a belief without serious examination, just for the sake of fashion, for example, would be foolish. Yet we have neither the time nor the strength to examine seriously all our beliefs. Therefore, it is wise to reserve the day's work, our questions, and our active doubts for such beliefs as we can reasonably expect to amend. Do not believe anything, but question only what is worth questioning. Intellectual courage, intellectual honesty, and wise restraint are the moral qualities of the scientist. That's the end of the long quote from George Polya, Chapter 1, Induction and Analogy in Mathematics. And that's where I got the title, Moral Qualities of the Scientist. I didn't invent it, Polya says it. But let's consider this. Should we be ready to revise any of our beliefs? Do you have that much intellectual courage? Should we change our beliefs whenever we discover they are disputed by experience? Do you have that much intellectual honesty? Should we refrain from changing our beliefs excessively? Do you have the wise restraint to resist changing your beliefs without a very good reason? Should we all adopt this inductive attitude as an epistemic virtue guiding our assessment of knowledge? That's a good break point. We'll do a breakout on that. But first, Shrikant, if people have questions, I'm willing to entertain them. How do you want to set up a Q&A?
Wonderful. So we have 4 rules, as always. Number 1, if you have a question, go ahead and type exclamation mark in the chat or raise your hand in Zoom. Number 2, keep on topic. This time we are just doing the clarification. So we're not doing large statements. We're simply asking questions, clarificatory questions. Number 3, be brief. Number 4, speak your mind. Feel free to disagree with anybody on anything and do so courteously. All right. Anybody has questions? Go ahead and type exclamation. Vanessa, what's your question?
My question was this, what about, should failure be encouraged? Some people are afraid to fail, so how does failure role come into this?
Yes, I think so. I don't think, yeah, Polya talks about in inductive work, as you're guessing, guesses don't have to be right. In fact, your first guess is very often not right. And so that's the dialogue, the negotiation with your experience to find some pattern, some explanation. Failure is an integral part of the process, yes.
Thank you. Next up is David, Jeff, and Joe. David, go ahead.
Right. So you said, well, there are three main terms here: reason, plausible, and induction. These like three big terms. And when you were defining reason, I was listening for see exactly what you were referring to, and it sounded a little broad and wide open, as opposed to the specific ability and faculty we have, which lets us really validate and build chains of thought based on principles, which are, the essence of logic itself, not contradicting, excluded middle, modus ponens, sufficient reason, that kind of reason, which says this is adequate thinking. That's how I validate stuff. It's purely formal. It's not based on there's any other authority. That's reason, not tell me something and now I have to use that as my basis for understanding stuff. So is there that broad sense of reason? I got the feeling your sense of reason, you were defining it as something more like any way we acquire any knowledge we can believe. Is this a difference? One is the faculty of checking logic and building combinations of thought, even synthesizing and analyzing. Is that different?
Yeah. Thank you. That's an excellent question. As a comprehensivist, I feel obliged to search through all my experience, and I discover that there are a lot of humans that share our planet that reason, their way of reasoning is spiritual or mystical or religious. And I said, do I want reason to stand for, as many academics in our world, for the prejudiced view that modus ponens and other forms of logic is the only right way to do reasoning? Or as a comprehensivist, must I consider indigenous knowledge that doesn't, as far as I know, use modus ponens? Should I consider religious knowledge? Are those ways of reasoning? Well, of course they're ways of reasoning. They're ways of securing knowledge. At the Greater Philadelphia Thinking Society, I believe you were one of the ones who recently read Kierkegaard on faith. And his reasoning doesn't involve modus ponens, it involves faith. Faith is a way that some people use to secure their knowledge. So I did impose into my interpretation of Polya my comprehensivist approach to reasoning, which I think if we want to really be comprehensivist and really consider and acknowledge and value all other people instead of deciding ahead of time which ones are allowed to be valid reasoners and which ones not, we need to broaden the definition of reasoning to include any way, any tradition of human inquiry and action has offered to secure their knowledge. Some people do it with faith, other people do it with astrology, other people do it with modus ponens. And at this phase, I'm trying to establish the epistemic virtues of comprehensivism and of science that will even apply for theological studies, that will even apply for indigenous studies, that will even apply for other non-traditional approaches to reasoning.
So it's about forming belief and what constitutes evidence and convincing, as opposed to logic reasoning from the Enlightenment. Okay, thanks.
Thanks, David. Next up is Jeff, Joe, and Greg. Jeff, go ahead.
CJ, I love the way you take these complicated things and wrestle them to the ground. I have just a very simple question, and that is, if in essence the things that we believe are things that we are based on what we learn from our experience, which is sometimes, we choose to learn different things from our experiences. And one of my favorite phrases is, learn the right things from your experience. Could you suggest any criteria or factors that go into deciding, what's the right thing to learn from one's experience?
You've hit upon a very important element, and that is that experience is interpreted, it's assessed, and I'm reading Jan Zwicky right now, and Jan Zwicky has this wonderful notion that a lot of our knowledge is ineffable. We can't even put it into words. Ineffable means you can't describe it. And if that's true, and Jan Zwicky makes a strong argument that it is true, then a lot of our experience we can't even talk about. We have to write poetry or something to get it across. And again, I'm in this comprehensivist view where I'm surveying and searching for all the different ways people approach experience. Some traditions have very specific ways to parse and interpret experience. And in those traditions, there will be a very precise reasoning that we as comprehensivists should study. But there are other traditions that get their experience and their interpretation of their experience from mysticism, from spirituality, from religious views, from faith, from poetry, from metaphor, from these ineffable literary humanistic kinds of searches. And as comprehensivists, I'm trying to define it in a way that everyone is part of the project of your experience matters, even if it's ineffable and you can't describe it, even if it's experience that most people disagree with. I hope I've hit it.
I was looking for three things. But no, never mind. I get your answer. Thank you.
Yeah, I think I answered it.
Next up is Joe.
Hi, CJ. Thank you for doing this presentation. The idea of questioning what is worth questioning, mentioned in the quote. It seems like when I look at the framework that he's providing us, it's the courage, the intellectual honesty, and the wise restraint are the three areas that he provides. Courage and intellectual honesty makes sense to me. Could you explain a little bit about the idea of wise restraint? And is this an ethical framework that he's providing us with in order to inquire, essentially?
Yeah, wise restraint is very important, I think. I'll talk about it more in the second part. But for now, let me say, there are situations where people, maybe they're oppressed people, maybe they're, very busy in their lives. They just don't have time or wherewithal to question all their beliefs, right? And Polya very eloquently, I think, acknowledges that there may be times where illusions are healthy, where it's good to have an illusion. And so wise restraint is knowing that, right now, if I question those beliefs, I need 6 months of therapy. I've got to pay the rent. If I question that belief, I'm off into a black hole. It may not be the time to go into that one. So it's very much a humanistic appreciation that, not everyone at every time is ready to question every belief. And we should recognize that, not force it upon others, not force it upon ourselves when it's not our time to explore that one. Some things either have to wait for later or wait for never. And that's okay. And I really, really think that's important in Polya's trifecta of the moral principles of science, the moral basis of science. So.
Next up is Greg. Greg, go ahead.
All right. I was curious about your initial speaking points, which was saying that the math is somehow different from the normal judgment of reality. And I'm thinking to myself, well, math is only as good as the assumptions that it's based on. And so too is the same thing with reality in general. Our ability to understand the world around us is only as strong as our assumptions that we make about it. And so just the same with when you're talking about reasoning comes from experience. That too, the reasoning, when reasoning makes sense, it's because it's fitting your assumptions. So what I'm wondering about with regards to this particular effort is, to what extent do you try to find a commonality in the assumptions that people assume to be true and on which all our logic is based? That's it.
That would be finding a commonality among experience and among our traditions of inquiry and action is a wonderful approach to comprehensivism. And I would value any such effort. Right now, in my wise restraint right now is that I'm trying to survey the range of human cultural traditions, the range of human intellectual traditions, the range of human art traditions, and so I'm in this expansive phase of my presentations and in my life where I'm surveying the breadth. And I would love it if one of you would search through that looking for commonalities, but right now that's not the phase I'm in. So I think it's a valid way to think about comprehensivism and science, but I'm exercising some wise restraint in putting that question aside so I can focus on other concerns.
Next question is from Laura. She asks, what is the basis of your need to investigate this problem?
The basis of my need, well, I tried to explain that at the beginning. As comprehensivists, we acquire a lot of information from studying the traditions of inquiry and action, laid out through the humanities cultural heritage. We gather information from the ethnosphere, from our cultural traditions. As comprehensivists, we consider all of our communicated experiences. We got that from Buckminster Fuller's definition of universe. And in considering all these things, I've now acquired this very contradictory and confusing, humongous inventory of knowledge. And I now realize, what are we to do with all that knowledge? How can we start making sense of it? How can we start assessing it, deciding what's important for us, or what's more true or more valuable, or, you know? And so last month on December 15th or 16th, I suggested we should look at multiple hypotheses. And tonight we're looking at George Polya's Inductive Attitude as a proposal for how to start assessing the vast inventory of cultural knowledge that we have acquired, so that we can make sense of it, because ultimately we want to make sense of it. And my first 5 or 6 topics just open the fire hose of knowledge. And it's like, well, we need to start making sense of it. I'm searching through the traditions of inquiry and action, through the cultural heritage, trying to find epistemic virtues that can help me and help us deal with this vast cultural heritage that we have beckoning us. This is my knowledge, this is my knowledge, this is my knowledge. And we don't want to reject any of it, but how do we make sense of it? That's a hard question we need to address.
Thank you, CJ. Last question is from Mike, and then we're going to go to breakout rooms. Mike, what's your question? Looks
Okay,
like. Go ahead.
I'm trying to rephrase some of this in terms that I might understand. And what I hear you saying, there are 3 words that maybe if you used would be helpful. One of these is domain, and the other is reality, and the other is heuristics. Greg Gorman hit a responsive chord with me too when he asked the question that I think he said, reality is an illusion. We really only have, based on our senses, an approximate idea of what reality is. And so we have to adjust everything in terms of that. So that implies that everything science tells us is conditional. If you want real dogma, you have to go to religion, because science gives you operational things that help you, but everything is subject to change. Domain means to me that this is valid this is valid in normal things for our senses. If you go down to the nano level, or you go up to the multiverse level, nothing we know may be still true.
Mike, can you culminate into a question?
Okay. The question is how much of that is true and how much of that is inductions. I know Polya did a lot of work on prime numbers before he wrote that book. And he came up with a whole bunch of theorems that now that they've worked, now that quantum computing has come up, are questioned. And then Popper came up with the concept of falsification as a means of
Mike,
that isn't even
supposed to be a brief question.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I got a question from Mike. Mike's question in part is the domain for validity? Is it sensory? Is it what domain's it in? And my comment on domain is that as comprehensivists, we're bringing in all domains. We're, as comprehensivists, we're accepting all cultures, all cultural traditions. That means we bring in all the mystical, spiritual, religious traditions, as well as the science traditions. And so the domain has to be very variable. And that's one of the reasons we can't really come up with heuristics. We might come up with some heuristics, and Polya does, for mathematics domain. But whether that's going to apply in spiritual traditions or not, I'm not ready to answer. Reality, you also talked about reality. And reality is a tricky subject. Reality is hard to know because we're often deluded and we have these illusions. But reality is, in some sense, from sort of this inductive attitude approach, reality is the meaning of our experience. Reality is conforming and adapting to our experience, which is very tricky. It's open to interpretation. It's complex. But I think, there is a reality. The question is, can we know it? And that's where it gets difficult. How do we interpret it? Reality, I would define as our best way of adapting to our experience.
Wonderful. Thank you, CJ. So we are about to start the breakout rooms. So what is the question you would like people to consider during the breakout rooms?
Yes. Should we adopt this inductive attitude with its three aspects, intellectual courage, intellectual honesty, and wise restraint, as an epistemic virtue guiding our assessment of knowledge? Is this inductive attitude a good way of assessing our knowledge?
Wonderful, folks. So these are the rules for the breakout rooms. And I'm going to start the breakout rooms now. They're going to last for 20 minutes. And then automatically or automagically, we are going to be coming back into this room for the second part of the presentation, starting the breakout rooms now.
Attempt to slaughter them.
Wonderful.
And they hold themselves.
Let me interrupt because everybody is going to be back
Okay, that's
in
fine.
a second.
Another time.
Another time.
Yeah, good. Okay.
Wonderful. Welcome back, folks. So CJ, are you back?
Yeah, and I just unmuted. It brings me back muted.
All right. So CJ, so now we go to the second presentation, which will be followed by the second breakout rooms and then takeaways. CJ, take it away.
Okay. We have learned that the inductive attitude involves boldly having the intellectual courage to reassess our beliefs when new evidence is found, having the intellectual honesty to change our beliefs when presented with disconfirming evidence, and having sufficient wise restraint to resist changing our beliefs without good evidence. Later on in Polya's book, he explains it in this other way. Induction, he has a section, induction, adaptation of the mind, adaptation of the language. It's a long quote, not as long as the first part. Induction results in adapting our mind to the facts. When we compare our ideas to the observations, there may be agreement or disagreement. If there is agreement, we feel more confident of our ideas. If there is disagreement, we modify our ideas. After repeated modification, our ideas may fit the facts somewhat better. our first ideas about any new subject are almost bound to be wrong, at least in part. The inductive process gives us a chance to correct them, to adapt them to reality. Adaptation of the mind may be more or less the same thing as adaptation of the language. At any rate, one goes hand in hand with the other. The progress of science is marked by the progress of terminology. That's the end of that second George Polya quote. Again, this is a powerful and incisive explanation of the process of learning couched in the language of induction, the language of science. It seems to me like a good epistemic virtue for our comprehensivity, for our broad learning about our world and how it works. Until we start looking for evidence among the traditions, cultures, and experiences where comprehensivists look for our knowledge, when we start actually looking, we find that almost everywhere, individual beliefs seem to trump the inductive attitude. As far as I've been able to determine, each of us espouses and clings to many core beliefs which we would steadfastly refuse to change regardless of evidence. How many of your beliefs do you hold onto so tightly that you would refuse to change them, even if the evidence against them seems strong? Are human beings constitutionally incapable of adapting to experience, to observation, to evidence? Is the inductive attitude unhuman and inconsiderate of our stubbornness? I'm reminded of the earlier quote I read from Polya, where he said, "There may be circumstances in which it is not unwise to cling to illusions." As I thought about that, I think maybe one circumstance is when we're momentarily confused by unusual circumstances. We rely on our core beliefs to reorient ourselves. When we suffer trauma, where our autonomy or our truth is denied by others, it may be wise to cling to some hopeful illusions about our worth and dignity. Shouldn't we give people the psychological solace of whatever illusions they may want to cling? Induction probably shouldn't be a destructive force crushing our psychological cocoons. From a comprehensivist perspective, before we adapt our beliefs, we should take into account all our experiences, including those that led us to our current beliefs, and including our learning from all humanity's traditions of inquiry and action, from all the cultures that comprise our ethnosphere, and from all our communicated experiences, as Buckminster Fuller includes in his cosmic intellectual concept of universe. That is, our inductive reasoning should accommodate all our comprehensivist knowing, including any incomplete, intuitive, and ineffable, or ineffable means unable to be put into words or expressed. Any of that knowing, incomplete, intuitive, or ineffable, I hope that is what Polya meant. Otherwise, with a too narrow account of experience, induction can become an imperial force, violently separating us from our traditions, our cultural heritage, our friends and family. If we do not want narrowly considered experiences to become a tyranny where induction runs roughshod over people and their cultures, I think we have to take a comprehensive view of experience and soberly accommodate all experience, including the often ineffable or undescribable bases for our beliefs. This is evidence that Polya's inductive attitude ought to incorporate the moral reform I talked about last month, T.C. Chamberlain's method of multiple working hypotheses. Then the full array of conjectures considered by the full scope of comprehensivist learning actually enriches our exploration. It helps us refine our judgment, fortified by the discriminative edges of all these multiple working hypotheses. In my interpretation of Polya, this is what wise restraint entails. Now we are starting to realize some powerful benefits from our comprehensivist approach. Our broad outlook warns us to the dangers of interpreting Polya too narrowly. Our broad outlook gives us access to more conjectures, more experiences to include in our inductive assessments. And our ready affinity to intensively engage this complexity in depth gives us the wherewithal to practice the wise restraint Polya recommends. In considering this comprehensivist context, including our practice of engaging multiple working hypotheses and honoring the full breadth of our comprehensivist experience, my question for you is, should we adopt Polya's inductive attitude of adapting our beliefs to our experience as an epistemic virtue, providing a moral basis for the practice of comprehensivism? And that will be the consideration for the second breakout. Thinking about epistemic, about the inductive attitude vis-a-vis comprehensivism. Shrikant?
Yes. So I'm starting the breakout rooms again. All right. Welcome back, folks. It's time for takeaways. Let's see. So anybody who wants to share your takeaways, please, you can go ahead and type exclamation mark in chat or raise your hand in Zoom, and we will go in order in which people type their exclamation mark. And I encourage you, all of you, to share your takeaways.
And Shrikant, I'd like to broaden it for any final thoughts, takeaways and final thoughts.
Sure. Takeaways and final thoughts. So just to give you a couple of minutes to collect your thoughts, let me tell you what's coming up. Next Wednesday, we are going to be, Sanjay will be here talking about neuroscience, and the topic is child's brain. The week after that, I'm going to be talking about the thoughts on change. This is based on Mortimer Adler's ideas. How did physicists learn to measure change? How did Darwin bring change into biology? How does psychological change happen? How does social change happen? What is the philosophy of philosophical debate about change between Parmenides and Heraclitus? So just, every field, how do they deal with change? So that's going to be 2 weeks from today. Then the week after that, Joe and I will be talking about the concept of ignorance in science, ignorance and the value of questions. That's what we'll be talking about. So that's what is coming up. So we're going to start with Paul. Paul, go ahead. Paul Hirsch, you need to unmute yourself.
Sorry. Okay. As I explained, I've only been in for I would say 20 or 30 minutes of the meeting. However, I guess a final thing that impresses me is that it seems to me that most of our beliefs are in reality not deductively or inductively arrived at, but are simply swallowed whole from outside sources, often authorities, that we decide to believe in, or even don't decide to believe in, but just simply adopt. The belief, for example, that you should eat 3 meals a day. I don't know that that was inductively or deductively arrived at. And as I go through all of my other beliefs, there are beliefs that I now have that I'm not even aware of are not independent beliefs that I derived deductively or inductively, but that I absent-mindedly, uncritically adopted from outside.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul.
Okay.
So folks, you can go ahead and offer your takeaways and final thoughts by typing an exclamation mark. Next up is Don. Don, go ahead.
Okay. I think the premise that CJ has launched here is a fundamentally good place to start. I don't know that it is the place to end a scientific inquiry. And I know when I do projects, we do planning inductively and create broad sweeps of knowledge and sense of things. But when I build a solution, I build it deductively. I build it keystroke by keystroke. And so I think the ultimate end is more complex than this, but I think Polya's position and the integrity of experience is a very valuable place to begin. So that's it. Yeah, thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Don. Next up is going to be Vanessa, followed by Deborah. Vanessa, go ahead.
Yeah, I think this was quite helpful. I've been kind of doing my life like this in some way or the other. Now it's like I can maybe give a name to some of the things I've been doing. And if I have a discussion with someone else, just like sometimes having a conversation, the terminology, so being on the same page versus just trying to, paint a picture, and I'm doing a Picasso and they're looking at a Rembrandt, and we end up with a Monet at the end, and we're all lost.
Thank you. Thank you, Vanessa. Next up is going to be Deborah, David, Laura, Jyoti, and Joe. Deborah.
Okay, so my first group, we were talking about this idea of people getting stuck in certain belief systems or certain theories, I guess. So I feel like, especially if you have an emotional investment in that, it can be difficult to kind of like evolve or expand your thought. But like, especially if it's something scientific, like realizing, or just even using as an example, that science builds on itself and most things are just incomplete, not necessarily wrong. And even our everyday observations may not be wrong. There's just more to learn. Could be a way to kind of bridge that gap, I guess. So like I was talking about the idea like Newtonian mechanics isn't wrong. It's just incomplete now that we know about like quantum mechanics. So I think if you can apply that to your everyday life and just say like, okay, well, maybe I took this turn, or maybe like, well, there is a lot more, but like just thinking that there's more to learn, I feel like could be helpful.
Wonderful. Thank you, Deborah. Next up is going to be David, Laura, and Jyoti. David, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, our group looked at the dangers of illusions that were mentioned by CJ, and the dark side of illusions, and also the fact that illusion has a pejorative connotation, meaning we know better that this is actually a false belief. And so it applies some other system that's more comprehensive. So another member of our group brought up the idea that with changes of your frames of referential systems, things that weren't true become truths. And so you have to sort of consider where you're sitting where you're sitting from looking at, okay? And this brought up the big question, a bigger question of, CJ, are you asking about a group epistemic set of values that we're looking at, or is this about for us, just individuals, deciding for ourselves how to, accommodate the world as an individual comprehensivist? Or is it about science or philosophy, how those disciplines should work? So, not clear. And the last thing was, I actually find a little deficiency in these three. I don't think it's enough, these three things, because they really don't spell out the idea of conceptual development, developing new concepts altogether in order to solve problems. And the example that someone gave, I think, is a good black and white example. You can say that the election was rigged, but then everyone hears a different concept of what rigged. What does that mean exactly? The election experts agree there were discrepancies, there were law changes, there were, rigged, but it means a certain thing if you have a stake in it a certain way. So there's sort of no single epistemic answer. There are views on that, and you have to refine conceptually to talk between these views. And I think it is even mentioned here in this epistemic model.
Wonderful. Thank you, David. Next up is Laura, Jyoti, and Joe. Laura, go ahead.
Hey, CJ, how are you going to reconcile the fact that to gather all this information is going to be an infinite process? So, how are you going to do that? Because, yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Laura. And CJ will have opportunity of addressing anything that he wants to address. Next up is going to be Jyoti, Joe, and Sanjay. Jyoti.
Hi, CJ. Wonderful presentation. Long time no see. I agree with your induction attitude or theory, whatever you call it, because I find myself all the time juggling with my belief system. And then it's like you use the right word, hypothesis. I have to have a hypothesis, whether I'm checking and rechecking to make sure that my belief system matches with my hypothesis. Coming from another culture and living in another culture has always been a juggling thing for me. So I think these principles that you were talking about, they help me to think a little bit better. And if I was to live in an island, I would not worry about my belief system at all. But since I have to live in the community, society, I think it behooves on me to all the time challenge my belief system. So what you just said makes me feel like I'm on the right track. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Joe, Sanjay, Judith, and Mark. Joe.
I mean, I liked what Don had said with the idea of using your experience as a very good place to start. But the thing that I really like about this is the idea of how it encourages you to challenge conventional wisdom. And I think that that's something that is really worth it. The other aspect of it is the takeaway is the value of illusions. I didn't necessarily think of illusions as a valuable way of analyzing the world, but it is. So, that's the other takeaway. Those are the major takeaways that I have. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Joe. Thanks. Next up is Sanjay, Judith, and Mark. Sanjay?
Yes, thank you. So I think inductive veracity is essential. It's very, very important to the sciences and mathematics. The point that I thought about as part of this is it's a broad activity that's definitely part of science and math, but also it's a part of everything that we do, and that is the art of communication. As I think about this, how can I or anyone know that our method of communicating is effective, or that it's correct, or it produces the correct results that I intend? For example, I know that I'm using English to communicate, but that's not enough. One of the goals of communication is to transfer a specific idea from my mind into another person's mind or into a group's mind. And the idea that I have in my mind may have associated with it additional knowledge, and also it may have associated with it assumptions that I hold, that I'm aware of. And so when I communicate the idea, I need to make sure that the other person either already has the associated knowledge and assumptions, but that I'm communicating those as well. And that's all. It's rarely easy to do that because you oftentimes don't know the other person. You don't know what frame of mind or frame of reference they're coming from. So if I believe that I've communicated the idea, I may not have. I may only have communicated a subset of it. So this is really a tremendous risk and a difficulty in communication. And I'm finding that this is at one of the cores of everything we do. So I mean, inductively, this is something it's extremely difficult to know for certain.
Thank you, Sanjay. Next up is going to be Judith, Mark, and Maritza. Judith?
I think it's a very valuable attitude, the inductive reasoning. I think it's important that we question our assumptions. And, Paul was talking about how we don't, the beliefs we hold aren't even inductively found or deductively, we just accept them, maybe mass media or whatever. We're just accepting them. So to spread our net wide and think about our experiences and be open to thinking about other people's experiences and put that into, it's kind of like what also I noted here, Don was saying when he does planning inductively, when he builds deductively. And I like that because I think that's where, that's that first stage when you are planning is when you want to be most open-minded and not everything is passed through words and not everything is passed through a certain cultural style. So we have to look for different ways that ideas are communicated. And I think inductive reasoning is a nice way to do it.
Thank you, Judith. Next up is Mark, followed by Maritza. Mark?
Hey, I just wanted to quickly say thank you to CJ for the presentation and for everyone who's in my breakout groups, because as an occasional visitor to the Comprehensivists, I think my understanding of the approach definitely took a step forward tonight. So I wanted to call that out. Thank you very much. As regards the inductive attitude, I like the idea of those three parts. Maybe there can be things added, as people said, but I think they're a very good basis. My sort of final thought about this is asking yourself the question, why do I believe what I believe? I think that's a very powerful question to ask yourself, especially if you're about to interact with somebody else. And then, of course, the other question is to ask, why does that person believe what they believe? I think if we can ask those two questions, it really aids in communication. And lastly, is inductive reasoning the best form of reasoning? When should you apply other forms of reasoning? I think you can argue about it. I think to disregard inductive reasoning is a major mistake. But I would say any form of reasoning is better than not reasoning at all, which unfortunately seems to be far too common nowadays.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks. Next up is going to be Maritza, followed by Becky. Maritza?
So it's interesting that Mark just made that comment, because I did want to mention that, the stress on reasoning here cannot be, forgotten, that any kind of guessing that's being encouraged here with this inductive reasoning has to be done with reason. Just to go randomly shooting about is no good. I really like the connection made to this chapter and the path forward for comprehensivism. I think it's a fascinating connection. And I see the value in learning from various different topics in a wide breadth and scope, and then using your innate curiosity to just keep questioning something that may have been a belief. And I don't think that we should have a belief without question of anything. I feel that all things should be questioned, but this method here with the caution of making sure that it's done in a rational forum does seem to provide for us a manner in which to pick and choose which questions would have validity and which of those are just a natural, maybe, I don't know, disagreeability, perhaps. So I don't know, I feel like this is a fantastic way to, if I were to introduce someone to comprehensivism or the concept of comprehensivism, I honestly would take this, and this would be a good starting point to me. Thank you. Thank you, CJ.
Thanks, Marisa. Next up is Becky, followed by Greg. Becky.
So deductive reasoning was brought up a lot in our breakout rooms, and so there's definitely a very good place for deductive reasoning. You know, we hold the information that we already understand, and with that, we should be with what we know. We should be working out whether or not things are consistent in our beliefs. But it's also important that we don't stick with just what we know. And it's important to use the inductive part of being courageous and going out and incorporating the new information that you learn. But how do you interact with that new information? Because not everything is worth putting into our framework and our understanding. And so perhaps that new piece of information is a contradiction to what we already believe, or what we perceive to be a contradiction. And then so it helps us to then be more reflective of, is it something that we're holding on to currently in our understanding that is not correct, or is it the thing that we're introducing into our understanding that is not correct? Or what was brought up was that perhaps there's something else that makes them both correct, but we're lacking that understanding. So it's like embracing the paradox, which was something CJ mentioned. And then so it's also okay to set aside these two things and come back to it later. But thank you for the presentation, CJ.
Thanks, Becky. Next up is Greg. Greg, go ahead.
Hi. Yeah, I spent a few years with CJ doing inductive reasoning with Pola, and one of the things that came out in our studies was that things can be true over a certain domain, okay? And then, but once you expand the domain, you get far enough, things start to fall apart. So I think, like, just with the same token, when you look at, say, Newtonian physics is fine in a certain domain. And there are truths that you can say in that domain. But we have to know what that domain is, and can we work with it? And by the same token, I think about, Gödel's incompleteness theorem, where he says, well, if you find a system that works, then it's not big enough to hold reality. The point being that you have to have an infinite number of assumptions to mirror or to model reality. And so too, with this particular exercise, when we start stepping out of mathematics and walking into whatever it be, art or philosophy or just plain old living, it's hard to find what is true. But all you can come up with, I think, is my belief, that all you can hold is truth within a certain domain. And that's the kind of thing that we can share. But I think it's a long haul to come up with absolute truth, or even try to find it.
Thank you, Greg. Next up is Robert. Folks, if anybody else wants to share their takeaways, you can go ahead and type exclamation mark in Zoom. Robert, go ahead.
Yeah, just in conclusion, I was also concerned about what the inductive evidence is for things. Right now, we're in a bind in our country where there is a huge number of people who believe there is evidence, data, that supports our present president as our next president, whereas there are many who don't, and you will get arguments. I'm not saying they're all valid arguments, but you will get arguments between people where they are expressing their views, and they say it is based on evidence. And so what happens when the evidence itself is questionable?
Okay. Thank you, Robert. So my takeaways, this topic of updating your beliefs is very, I love this topic. So actually I'm doing 3 meetups on this topic that are coming up. On January 30th, a mathematician, Stacy Harris, is going to be here talking about Bayesian thinking and Bayes' rule, and how do you mathematically deal with this? How do you keep updating your beliefs? So he'll be making a presentation, then we'll have breakout rooms to understand it. And then I'll be making my own presentation on Bayes' rule and Bayesian thinking. And hopefully, even if you're not familiar with mathematics, we'll get a gist of that way of thinking. So that's going to be on January 30th. This Saturday, January 16th, one of the close associates of John Boyd is going to be here talking about his idea of OODA loop. This is the loop of observing, orienting, deciding, and acting. It's a fundamental method of dealing with fast-changing situation, which was employed in military context. And we are going to try to see, and he also applies it. This gentleman's name is Chet Richards, and he applies it systematically to business. So this is a quintessential transdisciplinary presentation on that, on how do you operate in a fast-changing situation, continuously updating your beliefs and shaping your actions. And this Sunday, General Dan Bolger is going to be here, and he's going to be talking about how he figured out how to change the way of fighting in the US Army so that it can deal with insurgents. So moving from a traditional war into an insurgent war, which is tremendous amount of uncertainty involved. How do you need to structure? How do you need to think in order to deal with a fast changing environment? So that's another take. So these are 3 different takes on how do you update your beliefs. So that's what is coming up. So that's my takeaway. Now it's on to CJ. CJ.
Yes, thanks everyone for your thoughts. There were a couple of comments that I've decided to follow up with. Laura mentioned the infinite process. And one of the ways I'm dealing with the infinity of comprehensivism, it's so broad, multicultural, multi-traditions, humanities, science, pull it all together, is the notion of ideal. Truth is an ideal. We may never get to full truth, but it's an ideal that we can strive for. Objectivity, many people have realized that objectivity is not something a physical being in this world can ever fully achieve. But it is something we can strive for. It is an ideal that can help us assess our experience differently. And I think the inductive attitude is an ideal, something we should strive for. And comprehensivism is also an ideal. I gave a topic many months ago, I forget which month, on the impossibilities of comprehensivism. And there are impossibilities of comprehensivism, but that doesn't mean we should reject comprehensivism. It means that comprehensivism is an ideal that by striving for it, we may, as a moral compass, we may never achieve it, but the proposal of comprehensivism is that we should strive for this ideal. This is an ideal like truth, like objectivity, that humans ought to strive for. David and several others talked about illusions. And it's true, the word illusion has some negative connotation. If you read my essay, which I quoted in my presentation, if you read Polya's book directly, he has this wonderful, I think it's a wonderful passage on illusions. And Polya, this mathematician, actual true blood mathematician, acknowledges that it's not always unwise to cling to illusions, that sometimes there's a good reason to cling to illusions. Of course, if we recognize it's an illusion and we recognize that we're straying from our ideals, Polya says, the inductive attitude says, we should adapt our beliefs to our experience. But that doesn't mean that all the time illusions are bad. It just means that, every now and then it might be time to tackle one of your illusions and get beyond it. So illusion is a very subtle subject that I invite you to consider Polya's approach to, which I've tried to interpret and which others are interpreting. Sometimes some people really need their illusions, and one of the painful lessons I learned in my life is that bursting someone else's psychological cocoon because their illusion is illusionary is really violent, and I promise I will try never to do that again. David also mentioned the application of the inductive attitude, and I tried in this topic, in my essay, in my remarks, to indicate that I'm applying the inductive attitude to attempt to stake out and create a new tradition of inquiry and action, which I'm dubbing comprehensivism, or our comprehensivity, this attempt to take seriously Buckminster Fuller's idea that we want to understand all and put everything together. To stake out that ideal approach, infinite and impossible though it may be, I'm searching my knowledge of our cultural heritage to find epistemic virtues to apply to this new tradition of comprehensivism. And building on that, in Buckminster Fuller's magnum opus, Synergetics, he wrote, quote, "Many years ago, I developed a system of question asking, in which I ruled that I must always answer the questions from experience. My answers must not be based on hearsay, beliefs, axioms, or seeming self-evidence," end quote. Bucky had the inductive attitude, but unlike Polya is willing to let us have illusions. Bucky said, no illusions for me, no hearsay, no beliefs. I want experience-based evidence or I'm not believing it. He went rather radical. I decided to start off not giving Bucky's radical have no beliefs, only experience-based knowledge. With Polya's, where he considers illusions, and I think it's a more humanistic approach in Polya that invites us to keep some of our false beliefs because it's too difficult to change them all at once. But for some of us, some people, Buckminster Fuller in particular, he went, I'm not going to have any hearsay, no beliefs, no axioms. He gave up all axioms, all deductive reasoning, no such thing as self-evidence for Buckminster Fuller, only experience. That's one of the things I most like about Bucky. He's so broadly questioned hearsay, beliefs, axioms, the conditioned reflexes of our culture, that his thinking often sounds like the child pointing out that the emperor is wearing no clothes, but it's like everybody's wearing no clothes. When we fail to adapt our beliefs to experiential reality, when we fail to adapt our beliefs to our experiential reality, we soon become like arrogant emperors whose views are sadly divorced from reality. Frequently, such approaches do not end well. It is much better to notice ahead of time, proactively, when your experience starts informing you that maybe some of your beliefs, maybe some of your thinking needs to be better adapted to the realities of experience. We should include the experience of others to help us make these assessments, and the thinking of other traditions, indigenous cultures, other traditions, poetry, humanities, mathematics. This is the comprehensivist approach, to try to put it all together. Learning to pay close attention to experience, our own and that of others. Having the courage to question and even modify our beliefs to adapt to this experience. Having the honesty to change our beliefs when evidence contradicts them. And having the restraint to resist changing our beliefs unless the experiential evidence is strong. These are the moral principles of science and the moral principles for comprehensivism. It is hard work. We have to learn to listen to and more honestly assess the thinking of those we disagree with. We have to scrutinize our thinking in light of an ever-changing inventory of experience and the ever-changing assessments of others. This is where multiple working hypotheses and the views of others who are different from us can be so valuable. We can then more readily acquire the experience to precipitate a reassessment of our own thinking and our own beliefs. We can get our beliefs into closer alignment with reality. It is a project I think we should all strive to undertake. Next month, I'm preparing a topic based on a short Buckminster Fuller essay, Mistake for those Bucky fans in the audience, to fully consider our growing understanding of the epistemic virtues we need to practice comprehensivism more effectively. I hope you have time to read Bucky's essay. I'll be writing an essay, which I hope to start soon and to complete in early February. So look out for that event. February 17th. Thank you.
Excellent. Wonderful. Thank you very much, folks. And thank you, CJ. This was fantastic. And we hope to see you at one of the meetups back very soon. Good night, everybody. Bye.